Hi, I'm Old Sneelock. Welcome to another episode of Old Sneelock's Workshop. A few years back, we had a situation where everything changed on us, and we couldn't figure out exactly what we were going to do to make it better, so we did the best we could. Moving forward, we're going to find out that maybe it wasn't the best idea at the time. It was the one we had and the one we went with. And that was fine, except we just kept going. Now, it is 3 years later, and we're going to find out all the things that we kind of glossed over and said, well, we can get along without that. We're going to miss them. Hi, I was just going through some videos that I like. Salvage Workshop. The guy, he's a real hard worker. He finds and rebuilds old equipment, which is kind of dear to my heart because that's what I started out doing. Yeah, I worked maintenance at the Midwest Foundry. That meant that everything that was built was inside of a building that was built in the late 1800s. Now there were bits and pieces added onto it, of course, but the majority of the building was built in the late 1800s. And so there were things in there that just made no sense because they've been modified multiple times since their conception. Well, Salvage Workshop is working on a 1950s TerraTrack. Well, let's see, exactly what do they call this thing? Traxcavator. And it's a Caterpillar piece of equipment, and Caterpillar's a great company. I like their equipment. Always have. But people are telling him, just call Caterpillar. They have blueprints, and they can make any part for any piece of equipment ever made. Well, that's actually possible. It's not necessarily true, but it's actually possible. As of 2013, when I left the employment and retired from Demer Corporation, I had spent about 2 years working on the Caterpillar projects, both as a project engineer and as a technical writer, making work instructions, telling people how to build things, processes and procedures, and working out different bugs and the problems of how to build the darn things to print. And I have to tell you something, this might be disappointing to some and might be totally wrong in some cases. But in my case, in my experience, they're very, very true. If you call Caterpillar and ask for blueprints or parts from something that is no longer being made, there's going to be a problem. Now they might be able to help you. It's always a crapshoot. But I know for a fact that the engineering drawings that they have in their files do not reflect the actual parts being built at the time that they were being built. Engineering changes. That's something that every engineer goes through, and we understand that it's a necessary evil, and it makes it so that the records can be updated and life can go on for the people who follow us. But they're not perfect. There's a time lag. When you're building something for Caterpillar, and I worked on the 797 dump truck and on the Caterpillar M24 grader. When you're working on the parts, making the parts, you'll find that you make the part to the print that you bid on, and you send your first sample pieces, and they say, oh, this won't fit. Oh, okay, what's the problem? Well, if you're lucky, it's that a bracket's out of position, or a bolt is a different thread, or a little longer, a little shorter, something easily changed. Quite often it's a major design change that was made in the field at the contractor who's building the thing. And an engineering change was submitted, but not necessarily transmitted into the master file. The intern who is assigned the task of doing the upgrade or adding the engineering changes to the master file drawings is usually at least 3 or 4 engineering changes back. Now out in the field, they're working off a set of blueprints that somebody has tacked to the wall in their office with red lines all over it. Notations, changes, and if they're a good contractor, they've called Caterpillar and said, we had this problem, we solved it this way. And Caterpillar, the engineering department, overworked as they are, will respond and say, yes, that's good, or no, that's not. And that's okay, because over time you build up a relationship with your customers, and they begin to trust your judgment, and you begin to understand what they need, and life is good. But in case of Caterpillar, they're in a world market now. World market. That means everybody has a shot at bidding. So when you bid on an M24 grader component, you're bidding against people in Bangladesh and Mexico, China, Europe, Bolivia, Brazil, all over the world. Because Caterpillar ships these things all over the world, and they get parts from all over the world, depending on who does the best job for the best price. One can overweigh the other, depending upon who's doing the thinking. So, engineering changes are being made all the time, just to make it so that, well, the shop that has a huge milling machine like we did can set parts up and face them all off and 3 dimensions and not have any problem. It's a CNC machine. You plug it in, you punch the buttons, and it goes in and drills the holes exactly where they're supposed to go, as long as nothing breaks or moves or somebody sets it up right, or the normal engineering problems, normal manufacturing problems. That's not even engineering, that's just manufacturing life. Drill bits break, cutters break too. But anyways, so they're out there in the field and they find that they need to change something because they don't have a CNC machine. They're in a dirt floor building with a coal fire for heat in a barrel, and they're stamping out parts, doing the best they can with the die that was sent to them, and lo and behold, their machine isn't big enough to do the job. So they have to break the job up into 2 pieces so that their press can handle the job. Or they don't have a laser table that can blank out parts in a heartbeat and make them exactly the same every time. They've got guys with torches and chisels or grinders. Angle grinder was the greatest thing for manufacturing since sliced bread. It lets you make modifications on the fly and cover them up so that nobody saw them. So anyways, getting back to the original story, if you want to get parts from Caterpillar and you say, I need X, well, you're looking at the original part drawing. If you're lucky, if you can find it and quite often you can find somebody with a print or a drawing or a sketch or something and a part number and say, I need X. Or you're going to call Caterpillar and they're going to say, let's see, that was built in 1960 or 1975 or even 1980. That's 40 years ago. My working life consisted of 43 years in a factory before I retired. A 40-year-old piece of equipment probably has everybody who ever worked on it no longer in the business. And unless they were still making it last year, the engineer who's currently working at Caterpillar has never seen the thing or heard it run. So he's going to tell you they don't have it and they can't get it. That's because engineering changes. The vehicle, thing, piece of equipment, whatever you want to call it, that you're working on doesn't match the drawings that they have. And if they tell you they don't have one in stock and they can't make one, it's because they don't know what it looks like. They don't know what it ends up as, what size the threads are. Are they metric or imperial? There's a time during transition when they could have been one on one end of a hose and imperial on one end of a hose and metric on the other end, because they had to go between two components made in two widely separated areas, and it's what they had. So they built it with what they had, doing what they could with what they got. So don't be disappointed. Just remember that if Caterpillar went out in the field and had to do a design change, they would get out their print and their red pen and they would mark it up and initial it. And then it would get sent back to the factory, well, back to the main offices where the engineering department is, and it would be filed. And if the engineer was able to get caught up, and if he stayed at the job that he was doing, because they hop around like fleas on a griddle, he'll assign that to an intern. And if the intern is any good, which I'm assuming most of them are, they're going to work on that diligently, trying to get the changes made, while 3 other changes are being made out in the field. So they're going to change that same piece 4 or 5 times. That's why you're not going to get a blueprint from them, unless you're extremely lucky. And getting a part, if they have one in stock, yeah, they'd be happy to send it to you. It's not making them any money sitting in inventory. And back in the 80s, this idea went through inventory systeming that if you kept something over a set period of time, it started costing you money to keep it, which is true from one standpoint. You're paying for the square footage that it occupies in your building. You're paying taxes on the inventory, and so the value of that part goes down as time goes on, because it ends up originally costing you a set amount of dollars, and then that set amount of dollars can actually double in the lifetime of the part before you use it, due to storage costs and inventory costs and taxes and other things. So there was this idea that if you had more changes, more parts than you needed to make a change or an update or do a piece of maintenance, they didn't want them. When I worked at Douglas Autotech, we had punch presses. Some fairly good sized ones. Biggest I think was 400, and it was a deep draw press. And we had a tool crib that had nuts and bolts and parts and pieces and switches and PLCs and all kinds of things that you needed to do the repairs on these presses. Up until the 80s, when the engineer came through and optimized their storage. He threw out all the belts. Okay, you can get more belts. No, you can't. They don't make those. They're not size. 400-ton press has a bull gear and a pinion gear. And the pinion gear is driven by 8 belts. And they have to be matching sets of 8 belts. You can't have belts made from different batches because they're slightly different in length and width. And what will happen is one will be shorter or longer than the rest. If it's longer, it doesn't drive at all. If it's shorter, it does an inordinate amount of driving. So it'll either fail early or let the others fail early because it's not doing anything. So you have to have sets. Makes sense, huh? So they tossed out all the sets of belts. And that company, it didn't exist anymore. In the 80s, companies popped up and dropped out like flies. Holding companies bought them, broke them up, sold them out. They're just gone. So, by the time I got there, in the late 90s, they didn't have any parts for these presses. So when the press went down, we sent away and we ordered the parts we needed, and we waited 3 weeks, and then we put the parts on the machine. Isn't progress wonderful? So anyways, that's enough rambling for one day. Just remember that if you're working on old parts or old equipment, and I could tell you story after story after story about old equipment. If you're working on old equipment and you have a set of drawings, hang on to them like they're gold, because you're not going to get another set. And that is all the information on the thing that you have in front of you. And if you're lucky, you'll be at a place like United Technologies was when I first started working there. They had a bookshelf covered in dust. And it was in the maintenance supervisor's office, and I was the new maintenance supervisor. Well, they called me maintenance manager, but you know, title's a title. I was supervising a crew of 14 guys. So they had problems with the equipment. It wouldn't work right. They had been spit and baling wire repairing the things for half a decade or more. So I would walk out onto the floor and I'd be listening to the old Youngstown press over there. 1,600-ton hydraulic press. 1,600 tons, that's a lot of push. And I'd hear those motors just groaning. Well, it turns out that the valves weren't working quite right, and so they weren't opening all the way, and they weren't flowing the way they should, and some were leaking by, and so the pumps were working just way too hard trying to do what they needed to do. I went into the bookshelf and I pulled out the Youngstown press manual. Beautiful thing. 3-ring binder about that thick. Open it up. Blew off the dust. Open it up. Start leafing through. In the back, troubleshooting. Yeah, they actually used to do that. Troubleshooting. And it said, if it's doing this, check this. If it's doing that, check this. Youngstown made these presses, and they made them for quite a few years, and they made notes and kept records. They didn't change the design every 15 minutes or upgrade it to PLCs and get rid of all the electronics on the thing. They just made changes and made it work, and wrote down the changes and put it in that book. And then I go back a few more pages past troubleshooting, and I find loose leaf binder fold sheets, 3-ring punch, and it's notes from the guys who went before me. The place was built in 1950, year before I was born, and the people who put them in were old school. When they put them in, they made notes of any changes that they needed to do. We'll call them engineering changes. But since there wasn't an engineering department, there was just a maintenance supervisor with an office and a book. He made his changes in his book and kept them. There were notes from 3 different guys. They stopped about mid-70s, early 70s. And so they had 20 years of experience in this book that nobody either read, which is very possible, or they never took that information and made notes and wrote it back down in the book. So I went through and read that book. It took me a week. I was a genius. I knew exactly how to fix everything on that Youngstown press. We made some changes to bring it back to where it should have been. Got rid of some spit and baling wire fixes. One of which was having a 4-foot long pipe wrench holding a cylinder in place. Yeah, a hydraulic side jack cylinder. This big around. 4-foot jaws, or the 4-foot pipe wrench would open up enough to grab a hold of the end of the bell on the hydraulic cylinder, and they put a chain binder on the end of the pipe wrench and locked it down so that the cylinder wouldn't keep moving in the platen. Spit and baling wire. We got rid of all those things, and the machine started actually working like it was supposed to. Not perfect. It was 30 years old when I started there, and it was 40 years old when I left. So it had a lot of changes. Some of them were improvements. Hopefully everything I did made it work better. At least it seemed to. And I made notes in those books. But the plant is closed down and dark now. It's a gray field. Nobody wants to buy, lease, or rent it because it comes with this horrifying thing under the ground that the EPA is sure is going to destroy the world, but they haven't done anything about it. They had PCBs in the oil pit behind the building, and they were dug up, put into 55-gallon drums, put in overpack barrels, set in a dumpster, and driven away to some, I'm told, a clay lined pit. Once it's out of my sight, I don't know where it went. Could be down a drain next door. Can't tell. Did that a lot in Detroit. So, anyways, back to the engineering drawings. It's not necessarily what it was. Make the changes you need to make it work, and remember that that's what the engineers did every time they had to. If you have any suggestions for a new video, questions about today's video, or any of the other videos on the channel, just drop a note in the comments. You know I read them all. How do you like my shirt? Pretty much describes my life. Thanks for watching.
This video is not to be viewed by anyone under the age of 13 in the U.S. or 16 in the European Union without the express written permission of the parents or the legal guardians of the underage person. Such written permission must be on file at the local government entity in charge of enforcing the rules and regulations established by the FTC. Anyone violating these terms is admitting by default that they hold harmless the owners and operators of this channel. Any and all questions should be addressed to your local branch of the FTC.